Right, I think we can make a start. So welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to join us, for those of you with us. And also for those of you listening to the recording, thank you for picking up the recording later on. So yeah, today we're talking about cybersecurity risk and de-risking the use of cloud services. I guess a couple of house rules quickly. I'm happy to take questions as we go along. We'll probably be between 40 minutes and an hour, depending on how engaged everybody is and whether there's loads of questions. If you want to raise a question, Sasha is monitoring the chat. So if you just want to raise a chat, and Sasha will sort of let me know, and we can cover off the questions as and when it happens. So yes, welcome again, and hopefully you enjoy our webinar. So I'm just going to do a very quick introduction about for both myself and Sasha. So my name is Maritz Cloete. I'm an information security and cybersecurity consultant. Been working in the industry for near on a couple of decades now. My background is cybersecurity risk management, implementing frameworks such as ISO 27001, Cyber Essentials. I do quite a bit of security penetration testing as well. So that's more on the technical side of testing security, security configuration reviews as well. We do a lot more incident response work for customers now. So when customers have a security breach, we can come in and I sort of support that in terms of understanding what's happened and understanding the issue and the incident a bit better and helping sort of stop the breach from happening in the first place. And also a fair bit of security training, both from a general security awareness perspective all the way through to providing specialist security training to specific staff members as well. Joining us as well is Sasha Lawrence from Clearcom. Sasha is our business risk manager, and I'm sure those of you who know her know she's massively passionate about business resilience, cybersecurity, information security, and all the other sort of good stuff that sort of comes with our industry. And she's had quite a lot of sort of personal experience as well, especially with WannaCry in terms of dealing with the fallout of that. So Sasha is sort of acutely aware of the pain that the business can go through if there has been an information or cybersecurity breach. So without further ado, let's look at what we're going to cover off in today's session. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just a little bit of background around this whole cloud business. I mean, just look a little bit about broadly what it is, just to bring everybody onto the sort of same sort of level when we talk about cloud, just so we know what we're talking about. Then we're going to look at some recent high-profile cloud-related cybersecurity breaches. We're going to sort of examine a little bit about what went wrong and what the ultimate result was. Then we're going to look a little bit closer to home and focus on some incidents we've been involved with in the past few months that affected some of the fellow charities. Talk a little bit about what happened and also what the effect was on the organization and ultimately what the resolution was. And then for the most part, we're going to look at, right, cloud's here to stay. Most of us as an organization are moving to cloud, whether we're using Microsoft Office 365 regularly. That means we're on the cloud, whether you use Google Apps or Google G Suite. Most of the sort of work that's happening on the IT side of things is moving to a cloud model. So we need to take action to try and manage that risk as organizations. So we'll sort of cover off what are sort of key things that you guys should be looking at doing to reduce the risk of having a major cybersecurity breach in relation to your cloud services. So as I said, we'll be taking questions throughout the piece, but we'll close out with a bit of a Q&A session as well. So if you guys want to keep questions till the end, feel free, and we'll try and cover that off as best we can. So first bit is looking at cloud and what it means. So apologies to those of you who are cloud experts. This is probably a little bit of a little bit sort of stuff that you probably know already. But ultimately, just to give you a very potted history, back in the day, decade or so ago, most organizations had on-premise servers running their own applications, their own email systems. So ultimately, over time, in terms of trying to find ways of saving money, to reduce or to expand focus, to focus more and more on business type issues, organizations have moved to more of an outsourced model, probably in the last 7 or 8 years, where you've got third parties to run and host services for you. And a natural extension from that is really the cloud. So this is where organizations run services, they run applications, they run platforms, and rather than paying a massive amount of money up front to have servers that run stuff for you, they offer this on more of a utility basis or a pay-as-you-go basis. So some of the examples of these services are, as we spoke already about, is Office 365, Salesforce, Blackboard, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, and even services that you all sort of love and hate and use for yourselves, like Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. It's a very good example of cloud services, where if you do pay for the services, you tend to pay on a per user basis, or you basically pay for what you use. There's also other aspects that are considered cloud. So you get platforms as a service. So those of you a little bit more technically minded, you get the Microsoft Azure side of things, or Amazon Web Services, where you can actually deploy your own applications in an environment that you don't manage. It's not your environment, but you pay to use the environment, and you pay to use as much as you use. And also infrastructure as a service. So where you used to have servers at home or in the office, you can now run computer servers in the cloud. So you run it again on somebody else's infrastructure, and a lot less management for that. So just covering off why people are really moving and why they'll continue to move. I think, and my view is, it's really around the cost model, because it's about pay as you use. In the past, we have to spend quite a lot of money buying servers. It's a massive upfront investment. You need to have staff on site that can really sort of help you keep the lights on, make sure that those services are running, and when there's problems, that those services are resolved. If you want high availability, you've had to buy a lot of servers. Where with cloud services, a lot of that stuff sort of comes out of the box, really. Certainly around the upfront investment, IT spend changes from CapEx to OpEx, which sort of made the accountants happy. And also from a scaling perspective, it's easy to scale up and down. So maybe 10, 15 years ago, us as a small organization, as we were back then, we wouldn't have been able to run SharePoint or any of the sort of big, sort of more traditional enterprise applications, because we didn't have the infrastructure. Now we can spend 10, 15, 20 pounds a user, and we can get the whole suite of Office 365 tools, and we can essentially benefit from enterprise level software without actually having to spend massive amounts of infrastructure. So that's made moving to things like Office 365 very, very, very attractive. Obviously, somebody else is managing the infrastructure. So just from a staffing perspective, there's a lot less complexity. So you don't really need really specialist IT resources even to run some of these services, because a lot of it, it's actually quite straightforward to manage. And I say that there's obviously caveats to that. So really looking at adoption, as you can say, enterprises have been adopting cloud hugely. They reckon about 94% of organizations already use cloud in some way, shape, or form. So you may not even know that you're using cloud services, but you probably are. So really, cloud really sounds like a win-win proposition, really. But, and there's always a but, unfortunately. So when you come to security, and we look at it from through a security lens, ultimately, your data still resides in somebody else's data center somewhere on Earth. That data still exists somewhere, but rather than having it on premise with yourself now, you've given that data to somebody else to look after. So that really means that you're reliant on the effectiveness of their security measures to keep your data secure to a large extent. So what mechanisms have they put in place to keep your data secure? In many cases, you also have to take further action to make sure your data is secure. So for example, things like managing user access. That requirement hasn't gone away, because you now have to manage who's got access to Office 365, either you or your IT service provider or somebody who you appoint to do that. And also, probably crucially, you still remain accountable for security of that data, because a breach is still a breach. If you have an email breach, for example, nobody's going to go to Microsoft and go, why did you have a breach? They'll still come back to you, and they being the ICO, for example, and say, why did you not look after the systems that you put data on? Another bit of a complexity that comes with cloud is, in some cases, if there's a security breach, how will you actually know? A lot of these services are run by organizations that's maybe based in the US or based in the rest of Europe. And actually, them telling you that there's a breach is potentially an issue, because they may not know your data has been breached, or you may not be very high up in the pecking order in terms of them telling customers that they've had a data breach. So there's always that question about how will you know whether they've actually had a data breach? How will you know that one of their staff or one of their employees haven't managed to get access to your data? And then I just wanted to raise one other key point around cloud, which is worth remembering. And fundamentally, for cloud services, the internet is the basis for connectivity to cloud services, which means that most of the cloud services are visible in some way, shape, or form to anyone on the internet. And when we talk about internet users, we're talking about 4.3 billion internet users, of which a small subset are potentially bad actors. But actually, the services you provide is actually quite visible, or could be quite visible, particularly if something goes wrong, and that becomes visible to people. So from there, let's look at a couple of more recent high-profile security breaches that's happened. And these are ones that sort of became quite public quite quickly. And just to sort of put it in context, there's a couple of security researchers out there that's been running specific research around how attackers are targeting cloud services. And in the last year or so, they've seen 2.5 times increase in terms of cloud cyber attacks. So the cloud is definitely a target for attackers as well. And there's for multiple reasons. Obviously, there's the data theft or data manipulation side of things, which is attractive to attackers. But also, attackers are attacking these computing resources to repurpose them as well for things like crypto mining. So if you have servers in the cloud, they might try and get access to it so they can steal some of your resources to do crypto mining for Bitcoin, for example. Or they reappropriate those resources to become part of a botnet, which is essentially a massive compromised set of computers running on the internet, which they can then use for whatever purpose they want. For example, denial of service attacks. And they also found that there's a mixture of skills in the attackers as well, all the way from very skilled attackers to script kiddies. So the kind of people who look at attacking cloud services are no longer sort of the top echelon of hackers or attackers or crackers. There's a lot of packaged malware and packaged sort of attacks, which could be downloaded from the internet, which script kiddies could use, or people who are less skilled could use to potentially attack these services as well. So drilling down into something that happened fairly recently, and it is out in Australia, but it does demonstrate something quite interesting. So the first one, this isn't so much about an attack. And actually, one of the points we'll raise, or we will make as part of this webinar, is that when it comes to cloud, your biggest threat is actually malconfiguration or misconfiguration. And misconfiguration of services is what attackers look out for and scan for. And this is a really good example of that. So those of you who sort of are a little bit more aware of Amazon Web Services, Amazon provides a service called S3 buckets, which you can use to store data in temporarily, which can be accessed from anywhere, really depending on how you set up access. So a security researcher found an open Amazon S3 bucket, which essentially is a bit of a database. You can argue it's a database that contained 54,000 scanned driver's licenses of Australian drivers. So this was reported to the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and obviously that was made private fairly quickly, but the actual owner of the data was never known. So the question would be, how long has that data been available on there, and who else had potentially accessed those driver's licenses? These were basically screenshots of the fronts and backs of driver's licenses, so potentially fairly sensitive information. But the problem that this highlighted is that when it comes to something like Amazon S3 buckets, it's very easy to misconfigure these sort of services. And coming back to the fact that the services are available to anyone on the internet, if you accidentally set some of those resources for public access, as they've done with this bucket, then that data is going to be found. There's a service that we sometimes use when we do some of our penetration testing work, which is buckets.greyhatwarfare.com. And essentially that catalogs any public buckets that it could find that's got information in it. And it's got a catalog of almost 300,000 different buckets containing 3.6 billion documents. Now, a lot of those are potentially valid because people do tend to share, to put some of their website content onto buckets because it makes it easily accessible and it's quite cheap. But a fair bit of that is unintentional sharing of information. So you can see that sort of is quite a good example of unintentionally sharing data to the public. And you might not know it until you get somebody telling you that they found data that belongs to you within the public bucket. So that's one sort of example that was fairly high profile, and that was that was last month. And these, if you sort of keep an eye out on the security news, pretty much daily there's articles about people who found more potentially sensitive data on S3 buckets. Another aspect to consider for cloud is, again, it being accessible everywhere. Bring your own devices. So this is an example that happened a little bit earlier this month, where the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington was actually managed to get $7.5 million stolen from them, from the endowment funds. And it turned out that an attacker managed to compromise an employee's home computer who had access to company systems as well as Office 365. That machine was compromised. And essentially the attacker then continued to use that device to perpetrate the theft, pretty much undetected. Because it was only detected by a security contractor who noticed some unusual behavior on the user's Office 365 email account. So another consideration which we'll cover off is, how do you allow staff or other users to access these cloud services? Because even that in its own right could be potentially where security breaches come from. Another example of poor configuration, earlier this year, a Brazilian company accidentally exposed 76,000 fingerprints on a cloud database server. So it's not just things like buckets that gets exposed, but potentially it's also databases, because you buy databases as a service, and therefore potentially if it's malconfigured or misconfigured, that data could potentially be accessed. What makes it even worse is it's personal data that was not encrypted, and then publicly accessible, where if they managed to at least encrypt the data beforehand, then public accessibility, while still embarrassing, wouldn't have been such an issue. But in this case, that data is out there and essentially potentially compromised the identity of quite a lot of people. And again, the breach here was due to lack of configuration of access controls and lack of encryption. Looking a little bit closer to home, and I just wanted to touch on the Blackboard breach, because I think quite a few organizations potentially present here use Blackboard around fundraising, Razor's Edge, for example. So back in, and this is a really good example of the cloud application side of things, where you've got a big cloud application that a lot of organizations use, who then fall foul of a security breach. So what happened in this case is, back in May 2020, Blackboard as a company fell foul of a ransomware attack. And the attackers managed to get onto some of the infrastructure that actually hosts the Blackboard applications. They managed to encrypt some of the databases that contain customer data, and went on to then ask for a ransom, as you do for ransomware. When Blackboard said they weren't going to pay the ransom, the attackers basically confirmed that that the data was actually stolen before it was encrypted, which is a common trait now for ransomware, where it actually takes a copy of the data before it encrypts it, and then continued to threaten to say, well, we'll release this data publicly if you do not pay us. Blackboard went ahead and paid them, which again is not necessarily advisable when it comes to ransomware, but they did. And then subsequently, they've been notifying organizations across the world that potentially their data has been breached. And that data contained customer relationship management data, customer data, and as you might know, a huge amount of tertiary education organizations were affected. Many universities in the UK potentially as well, but also a lot of organizations in the charity sector was affected because the attack potentially touched on data that's held in the Razor's Edge platform. And actually, at the last count, the estimate was that around 50 charities lost data as a result of the breach, or lost in terms of the data that their data was included in the data that was actually stolen by the attackers. So, and amongst those would be was, as far as I understand, National Trust, Crisis, and Sue Ryder, and all of those had to notify both their customers and the ICO of the breach. So, apart from being a lot of sort of management overhead in terms of dealing with the breach, you also have to sort of reasonably go public to say, well, actually, we've had a big data breach, and Mr. ICO, we've had a data breach. What do we need to do? Or this is what we've done. What do you want us to do? And the Mines Advisory Group being one of the latest that sort of contacted their customers to say they've also been attacked. So you can see the timeline here is from May 2020 to August. So we're talking about a breach that happened almost 4 or 5 months ago, and it's still having repercussions. So the Blackboard one was actually quite a big breach. I think some of the ones that was a little bit closer to home, and these are the next two examples was really sort of two we were involved with. This one was a UK charity, quite a small organization, but on Office 365, solid processes, solid business processes for transferring grant money to startup businesses. One of these transfers went through as per normal. However, the following day, the third party received an email from the same person asking them to change the bank account details, pretty much with exactly the same request, the exact supporting information. Luckily, the recipient became suspicious, queried it with another worker who then raised it back to the charity concerned, and no payment was made. But potentially there was a loss of £150,000 involved in that. So what happened in this case? Well, quite simply, the attackers logged into the person's Office 365 account with his credentials without even a failed login attempt, which means that somewhere along the line, that person's Office 365 or that person's user login account has been breached, either through phishing or through the use of poor passwords, which was just guessed. And I think what we need to consider here is the kind of attackers we're looking at in this case was actually very, they seem to be very experienced in what they were doing, because they literally just logged in enough times to be able to perpetrate the attack, and then they were gone basically. So, but this is a good example of the kind of, because you've got services that's available on the internet. In this case, the user was based in Madrid, but the attacks actually happened from London and the US, from a US on a rented server. So it just shows that the services, cloud services, are much more accessible and is very sensitive to access controls and poor access controls. The last one we'll look at very briefly is a malware attack, actually. And again, this was through Office 365, because, well, in this case, what happened is the organization started getting complaints of phishing emails from trustees and beneficiaries, phishing emails being sent in 2 tranches on sort of the Wednesday or the Friday of the same week. The bit that was interesting about this malware was that the phishing emails actually contained content from prior email correspondence with clients and other sort of contacts. We managed to when we did the incident response, we looked at the actual malware, and we also identified that apart from just the malware links being sent out, so at some point a shared email account was hacked, in a similar way to the email compromise we talked about just now, but actually about 3 gigabytes worth of data was taken as well. Again, Office 365, and they had to notify the ISO of potential data breach as well, because the mailbox contained benefit application forms, which was potentially quite sensitive. And in this case, we looked into it. It was actually Emotet, which was is quite a well-known malware strain, and it just shows that again, attackers are targeting the likes of Office 365 and cloud services, because they know potentially there are weaknesses in the way that it's being managed, it's being set up, it's very accessible, it's not being monitored very well, and therefore it's just an easy target. It's an easy target for stealing data, it's an easy target for taking over and using for their own nefarious means as well. And ultimately what happened with this client at the end is because the breach has been going for some time, they actually lost quite a bit of confidence in their own IT infrastructure integrity, and they weren't able to determine whether any of their local machines were actually infected, and it resulted in a complete rebuild of their IT infrastructure, which luckily, small organization, but as a bigger organization, that could have been quite destructive as well. Okay, so that's just a few examples of the types of sort of incidents and attacks and security breaches that happens on a cloud type infrastructure. But as we mentioned a bit earlier, the cloud is still a very important part of IT these days and our services, and it's not going anywhere. And more services are moving onto a cloud-based model, and more new services are being provided as on the sort of cloud/utility basis. So what can we actually do about that, really? We're just looking back as we sort of covered off some of the risks that have sort of the risk profile that's really changed. The kind of risks we need to plan and protect ourselves against now it's really changed, because there's more direct exposure from threats from the internet, given the nature of cloud services. We've got a larger number of potential attackers and types of attacks, where back in the day when a server was sat in an office, you only really had to worry largely about staff in the office or people who got access to the network, where now you almost have to worry about anybody on the internet potentially gaining access to services or attacking you. Cloud services are a lot more sensitive to security configuration errors for the same reason. If you accidentally configure a service as public, as we've seen with the S3 buckets, then essentially you, without knowing it, you could potentially publish a lot of very, very sensitive information to a lot of people. And there's a lot of automated hacking tools out there that is literally just looking for certain misconfigured services, and then will pretty much automatically steal all the data in those services. You've got less direct control over where your data resides, how it's stored, and potentially how it can be accessed, and a whole raft of other sort of differences or change in the risk profile. But from the work we've done in the past and sort of building on what we know about some of these incidents, I think there are some really key things that you can do, regardless of your size, really, in terms of using cloud. The first part is really getting the governance right within using cloud. So having very clear policies and procedures in terms of how do you procure cloud services, who's allowed to buy cloud services, what are we allowed to use cloud services for? When we do use cloud services, what is the security restrictions and the data restrictions we placed on it? What data are we happy to reside in the cloud, and which data do we feel a bit less comfortable with using cloud services for? Maintaining an inventory of those cloud services that you do use, I think, is absolutely key, as well as the data that's held in those services. That's particularly important when you do have a breach, because you know what data is breached. And ultimately also having clear business owners assigned to each of those services. Obviously, if you've got the inventory, then you need to review that from time to time. and make sure that over time, you're still happy that the data that's held in these services is appropriate, especially if you use CRM systems or systems that hold a lot of personal data. Make sure that you've got some element of monitoring, reporting around how your own controls are operating around those cloud services. So you put all the sort of rules and policies and procedures in place, but make sure that that actually is working, whether that's through maybe an internal audit program or just reviewing it from time to time, particularly the services that host sensitive data. And lastly, just hooking back to data protection as well, make sure that wherever you use cloud services, that you always do data privacy impact assessments as part of that as well, especially as you don't always know where the cloud services are hosted. So you need to take into account all the rules around data transfer, for example, with Schrems 2, as some of you might be aware. You can't rely on Privacy Shield anymore for services hosted in the US. And there's a whole raft of considerations that sort of touch on security as well, that the DPIA should be able to unearth for you so you can manage those.
Maritz, can I, we've had quite a good question come in from Tim Moss. And I think it was following your discussion around Blackboard paying the ransomware.
Yeah.
He asks, if an entity pays a ransomware, could this be classified as a criminal act? And have there been any cases where the user has been prosecuted for making such payments?
Not as far as I'm aware. Often some of these things happen outside the view of public, generally. I've not seen any reports of if you pay that you'll be seen as a criminal in your own right. I don't think the government or the sort of law enforcement will see it that way. However, paying it's such a difficult choice, because I mean, you're putting your trust into potentially somebody who's already a criminal. I mean, how do you know that you paying them isn't just another way of sort of identifying you as somebody who pays easily, and then you might be subject to more attacks, or potentially they'll milk you for more money as well. So paying for ransomware, paying the ransom, I think I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I think the ICO will audit you anyway, because they'll be wondering why you received it, why you were affected by ransomware in the first place. It's not going to make any difference to them. Yeah. And I do believe the NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre, they do frown upon it, and it could affect your cyber insurance premiums. So it's definitely something to look into.
Yep. Any other questions for now? Or that's the main one.
No, not at the moment.
Okay, cool.
They'll continue to come in.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. The next step that I think we all need to do is making sure we do proper due diligence when we actually select the cloud service provider. Same way as we would do if we outsource services. We really need to look at what assurances is being offered around the services security, and ideally looking at what third-party certifications these organizations have. So the kind of things we normally look for, and that I would suggest you guys keep an eye on as well. ISO 27001, organizations should really have that if they process any of your data, really. And most cloud service providers have got that. For example, Amazon and Microsoft, and some of the bigger security cloud application services. The other one to look out for as well is the Cloud Security Alliance CSA STAR certification. That is a standard that's come along over quite a few number of years, and you can get the service provider can actually get an audited version, which is a level 2 or above, which you're looking for. Anything below that is self-assessment, which is good, but it's not as good as actually having a certified, third-party certified service. Now, SOC 2, which is Service Organization Control 2 Type 2s, that is really more from the US side that's being driven, because that's part of, again, an audited standard to make sure that organizations look after security, privacy, and so on and so forth. But it is actually quite a rigorous process to go through for organization to get SOC 2 SOC 2 certification. So that is a good one to look for, certainly for a lot of these organizations that provide software as a service and so on and so forth. And then lastly, for UK providers, it's worth looking at whether they've got Cyber Essentials Plus. Now, Cyber Essentials Plus wouldn't necessarily give you any specific assurance over the service itself, but that means at least as an organization internally, they practice good cyber hygiene. So they're less likely to fall foul of ransomware or other malware, because they sort of, their staff and their employees have got reasonable security practices. So those are sort of some of the key ones they look out for when you pick a cloud service provider.
Again, Maritz, sorry to interrupt you. Quick question here from Andy Stiles. With the standards, what do you mean by ISO 27001 scope covering cloud service? So
ISO 27001, which is the Information Security Management Standard, you can select a part of the business that's covered as within that scope, or you can pick the whole business. So what happens is a lot of these organizations are multinational. They host in various different countries. So what you want to make sure is when you see the certificate, it actually covers the service that you get from them. So for example, if it's a certain application that you get from them, then that should be specifically mentioned in the scope of the certificate they provide you. What organizations have done in the past is they'll certify their HR department and then say they're 27001 certified, which is obviously not really what we're looking for. We're looking for something that validates that where your data is stored and all the processes and all the systems around that is specifically secure. So the data centers they use, the specific applications, the system development, all that sort of stuff is covered by 27001.
Thank you, Maritz.
Yeah, okay. I think Mike, Mike has raised his hand. I think you can actually unmute Mike's microphone if he wants to ask a question in person rather than typing. Oh, we've got a couple of hands. Excellent. Ooh, let me just see.
Hi, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can do, Mike. Yes, hi. Thank you.
I didn't want to miss the chance before you moved on the slide.
That's cool.
You mentioned Cyber Essentials Plus there, and obviously that's the higher level of Cyber Essentials.
Yep.
That's something you'd recommend for all organizations getting, or is the Cyber Essentials standard or whatever it's called, just Cyber Essentials? Okay. I realize it's self-assessed, isn't it? That's the difference.
That is the difference, yeah. And I think if you look at a third party looking after your data, then I would definitely go for the plus one, because it is self-assessment, although there is fairly rigorous testing of responses on the self-assessment piece. I don't think it really gets to the same level as the audited version, which is Cyber Essentials Plus. I would always recommend companies go for Cyber Essentials Plus anyway, just because you've got that third party assurance on the back of that.
Okay, thank you, thanks.
So I think we had a couple of other hands as well. You're just on mute, Sasha.
Thank you. I'm trying to find who else has got their hand up. We've got a few people in here who...
So Marie Magame?
Yes, I'm going to search for her. Sorry, she's not coming up on the list. There we are, Marie. Marie, I'm just going to allow you to talk now. There we are.
Sorry, I pressed that by mistake.
Oh, okay. Well, it's good to hear from you anyway, Marie.
Thank you.
Okay. And we've got Martin Tyler as well. Martin, please go ahead.
Oh, I might just unmute, sorry. I think it might just...
Come on, I'm pressing it. It's not allowing me to unmute. Oh, here we go.
Now I can
Martin.
Sorry, I don't know how that's come up again, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Not a problem, Martin. Okay, any more questions? I think we've covered them all now.
Okay, cool.
Maritz, you can continue. Thanks.
I think we're just randomly picking people and asking them to ask us questions. I think that's probably what we're doing. Thank you. Cool. Okay, so we talked about governance. We talked about picking the right cloud service provider. another part which I think is absolutely key is making sure that you've got relevant cloud security configuration skills, or just cloud configuration skills. I think, as we've shown with some of these specific incidents and the sensitivity to security configuration errors, you really want the people who look after these systems for you, build these systems for you, set these up for you, to know what they're doing. So ultimately, and I appreciate you guys aren't experts necessarily, but we need to find, or you need to find a way for whoever you're using to be able to demonstrate that they've got expertise in setting up that specific system, that specific platform. And I've put a few certifications on the screen there, but again, that's just very, very high level. So if it's Office 365, you want some reasonable Office 365 expertise. Amazon Web Services, same thing, and also Google Cloud. And most of the service providers will have some sort of certification scheme for administrators or for technical staff, so that you can actually make sure that they've got the right level of skills. So one of the things you may have to go away now is have a think about what are the cloud services you use, and is your staff adequately trained to set that up properly? Is your IT service provider adequately trained to set that up? And have they got the badges? Have they got the expertise to be able to set you up securely? Unfortunately, we have found in the past that IT service providers are really, really good at building and really, really good at getting systems up and running. But when it comes to really tying it down and making it really secure, that's not always their best suite, because they don't necessarily have the time. It might not be a provision in the contract, but ultimately that could leave you quite exposed if you're running a system that's got default security settings, which may make the system less secure than what it should be.
Again, Maritz, we've got a few questions.
Yeah,
Happy to take them?
Hopefully there are questions.
So yeah, there's some really good questions coming through. So Tim again asked, to what extent is the use of VPNs or end-to-end encryption easy to implement at a reasonable price?
Okay, and is that specifically, I guess that's specifically to cloud services, I imagine. I think if you use services like Amazon Web Services, then the go-to way of sort of getting rid of the public access side of things is to use VPN connectivity between your office, for example, and the services in the cloud. I think fundamentally most services have got an element of public access. So I don't think it's expensive to set up VPNs, it probably just depends on the kit that you use. And it's quite practical as well, but it needs to fit the way that you want to interact with the service as well.
Thank you. And we have another question for Andy. I'm going to allow him to talk here. It's kind of touched what you've just spoken about in this slide about understanding how an IT company is adequately trained. Perhaps we'll let Andy speak. So Andy, hopefully you're going to be happy to ask this question live. Can you hear us, Andy?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, thank you.
Yeah, so it comes down to most businesses, and I guess ours no different. We rely on outsourced IT providers to do the configuration.
Mm-hmm.
So have that confidence based on everything you said around it needs to be properly configured, that our IT companies has the wherefore and the skills to do that.
Sorry, that broke up just as you asked the crux of the question. Are you saying what are the sort of indicators that they've got the right skills?
Yeah, how do we test that? Because obviously, I guess IT companies don't need to be certified themselves, but how do you get assurance?
But you do. Yeah, you do get vendor certifications for organizations as well. So you get Microsoft Silver, Platinum, Bronze, Gold partners, for example. And the same with Amazon Web Services. You actually get organizations that are sort of, I wouldn't say branded partners, but as an organization, they've done enough to be able to be certified by that service provider. And it is not an easy one, because it's not always that black and white, because you might have some very good people within an IT service provider, but they might just not have gone through the expense of going through some of these more rigorous partner verification programs, really. So it is a difficult one, but I think it's something that we should at least try and at least look at when we do pick service providers, and challenge them and challenge them to justify to you why they've got the right staff on board and what. And also the other thing you can look at as well when you pick service providers is reference sites and reference customers. I think you have to make sure that those reference customers are representative of what you want them to do as well. And also checking that they haven't had any major security concerns.
I can also add to that as well, Andy. I mean, the other thing you could look at is scorecarding. Scorecarding them based on their own security culture itself. You know, you can ask them things like, have they got Cyber Essentials Plus? Have they got ISO 27001? Are they putting their staff members through regular training? Can they show you pen test reports that they've done, internal and external pen testing? And you can create a scorecard system based on not just your IT managed service provider, but also other third parties as well.
And I guess based on some of the flaws or problems you would have seen in some of the case studies you outlined earlier, normally for me, I'd expect my IT provider to manage all that log information because I wouldn't have the expertise and the expectation of the provider.
Yeah, if that's the case, check your contract, because in my experience, they will look at logs from a fault finding perspective, but they will not look at logs to try and find security breaches proactively. So, was that the question?
Yeah, it's just one of those that what makes a good IT provider and what doesn't. So it's just an ongoing.
And unfortunately, the answer is you do get what you pay for as well in many cases. So yeah, there is an element of that as well, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Andy. Just going back to the ransomware, Sean Beresford, who's one of our data protection officers, he's mentioned a case that was also in my mind when we were talking about ransomware. So he again agrees with what we've discussed already, that ransomware is not a criminal offence in itself, but covering up a data breach, which could be paying a ransomware could be considered to be that if you don't go public, could result in a prosecution. And recently, very recently, in fact last week, it was announced that the CISO of Uber had tried to cover up the cyber incident that had exposed 57 million customers' personal data, 600,000 drivers' details in 2016. And he's actually been charged, excuse me, with obstruction of justice in the United States. So there are some implications, and that's definitely set precedent going forward. So, you know, the jury's out in terms of the whole payment of ransomware. We do not advise it. Back to you, Maritz.
Okay. Right, I'm going to move on then, if that's okay, unless there's any other questions. That'd be good. The next aspect that we do, and again, this is probably not that easy if you don't have a lot of IT resources to hand, but whether it's yourself or whether it's your IT service provider, must mandate the application of good practice technical security baselines. So this is really standards that are out there, they're available, they're technical standards in terms of how to tie down a lot of these services. Problem is things like Microsoft 365, Amazon Web, it's very technical services, and there's many ways of configuring it, and it's very, very easy to make configuration errors, which is what sort of led to baseline security guides being developed. And whether it's your own team that builds or creates or supports these services, or whether it's an IT service provider, make sure that they give you the assurance that they are using good practice security standards. So one of the examples for this is, for example, for most of us use Microsoft 365. Microsoft's got a compliance score, which is very easily accessible by whoever manages your Office 365. And it gives you very, very clear actions to take to improve security. And in fact, if those organizations that had the security breaches earlier that we talked about had followed those security good practice, they would not have been breached, because they would have put in the necessary controls or the necessary sort of lockdowns to stop those specific attacks from happening. Yeah, so, and similarly, AWS, Amazon Web Services have got good practice guides. for securing its services, including S3 buckets. And again, if those organizations that suffer those breaches have followed those good practice guides, much more unlikely that this sort of breach would have happened. So it's not an impossible task to secure cloud services. It just takes a bit of willpower and somebody to say, thou shalt secure it for us. And that's in the contract, and you will do it. Because the alternative is much worse. Now, this is one I feel like I just, I keep on saying day in and day out. And it is really more applicable to those of us who use cloud applications, Office 365 and other services. And that's making sure that we don't have weak usernames and passwords, or weak passwords specifically. Because these services are accessible on the internet, attackers are continuously trying to log in a lot of these services. For Microsoft Office, all you need to know is somebody's email address. And that actually makes it really easy for an attacker, because they go to Microsoft's website, they say log into Office 365, they already have your username. Your username is your email address. And they can then try passwords as much as they want, whether that be passwords that was breached in the past that they've got from a password list, or just simply guessing passwords. And in most of the breaches we looked at over the last 6 months or so, there's a very strong flavor of being, or password guessing going on, or password spraying, where user accounts have been accessed, or tried to access user accounts 200 times a day from all over the world, literally just trying to guess passwords. So looking after users' credentials is absolutely crucial for using cloud services. And part of that is strengthening the way that you authenticate that user. And one of the more common ways of doing that is to use two-step verification. So you've got a username and a password, and you either get sent a one-time code via text message or via a voice call, or one-time code on an application on your phone. And that is one of the more effective ways to actually secure user accounts. So what we always recommend to all our customers is turn on two-step verification on Office 365, turn it on Google Mail, turn it on all your sort of business applications. Make sure that it's turned on. There's a way of, you can set it up so that the user doesn't get asked for two-factor all the time. So for example, you'll only get challenged with two-factor if you're logging in from a different computer or logging in via the web. So it is designed to be user-friendly. So don't sort of move away from it because you think it's not user-friendly. But it is ultimately one of the best defenses against password theft or password loss. So that's my little, on my little soapbox note to sort of everybody out there, because we still come across a lot of our customers that haven't got this switched on, where we've always met with the message we get back is, we sort of meant to switch it on, but it seemed like it was a little bit too hard to turn it on. It becomes extremely easy once you've been breached because you just turn it on. But then unfortunately it's too late. So please make that a priority to turn on two-factor or two-step verification. I think this is our second to last one, probably. So this sort of touches back on bring your own devices. And in fact, we believe that most of the breaches we've had in the past have got an element of this involved, where staff use their own home computers. They can access Outlook through there, or they can access Office 365. But they also use that machine for other purposes, browsing the web, playing games, and potentially other users in the household also uses that machine. So you're never sure what the state of that machine is in terms of whether it's got the right version of Windows on, does it have a secure version of Windows on, do the user apply security patching, is there antivirus, anti-malware on that machine, and in what state is that user's access controls? Because malware looks for these weaknesses to try and infect machines. And once malware is on a BYOD device, it doesn't care whether it's trying to attack your business accounts or the user's own accounts. Potentially anything's at risk. So what you do need to do around cloud access is have a very clear policy around whether you allow staff to use their own devices to access cloud services. And this counts for mobile phones as well, because they're just as at risk in many cases. So the first step is make sure whether you, or just make sure that you're clear about what is your policy on BYOD. In fact, put controls in place to prevent non-compliant devices from using those services. And you can set that up on Outlook and Office 365. But what we do find is often people consider the problem and realize that actually, whilst BYOD brings a lot of benefits, it is more risky than what it's worth to allow people to use their own devices for the cost of a laptop that you manage as a business versus the cost of a breach, often, and also the cost of trying to manage people's devices who are not actually part of your organizational assets. Often the step is just not to allow BYOD. So that's what we see out in the industry. Excuse me. Actually, this is the second to last one. Just mentioning cybersecurity awareness again, making sure that staff are very, very aware that their login details are gold. It's gold dust to attackers. It's gold dust to hackers. If a hacker can get hold of a username and password, that basically means that they've won. They can access anything that user can access, for example, on cloud services, especially Office 365. It's not just email that's accessible. It's potentially everything on SharePoint that person got access to, their OneDrive, and so on. So it is very important to continue your cybersecurity awareness campaigns and to make sure that staff are aware that potentially they may be targets, that they need to be aware of phishing scams and other methods used to steal login credentials, and mainly just make sure that they stay alert to any sort of unexpected messages by email or anything that could indicate that potentially somebody's trying to get to their credentials. And also, one of the things we've noticed as well is staff need to be made aware that they need to tell somebody if they think they've been subject to a phishing attempt, or even if they just receive phishing emails. Some of the incidents we're looking at, when we go back in time, an incident might have been reported in August, but when we actually look at some of the forensic evidence, there's evidence of issues 2, 3, 4 months before where similar incidents have happened, but nobody's reported it. So making sure that staff are vigilant and do report, whether it's to the chief operating officer or to their line manager, or if you're lucky enough to have a dedicated IT security team, make sure that staff know that they can feel free enough to report potential concerns to the right level, to the right team, so those can actually be investigated, because they may be indicators of bigger issues that you might just not have detected yet. And the last bit, really key, is incident response. I think unfortunately when it comes to something like cloud, a breach is probably more of a when than an if. But make sure that you know what you're going to do if you potentially have a breach. So have incident response plans, make sure that you've tested those, make sure that you at least have some idea in the form of maybe playbooks or key steps. What are you actually going to do when you have to deal with a security breach relating to cloud services? The other aspect you can consider is actually simulating specific breaches. So if you are reliant on a specific cloud application, take some time out with the right team, simulate the fact that you've had a breach, go through what you're going to be doing, to investigate the breach, who you're going to tell, and who you're going to call in to support that breach. And also including things like reporting to the ICO, practice those so that you don't have to make decisions when it's really crunch time. And you've got all those things sort of set out up front. And the last point I think is quite key, and this is probably more from me as an incident responder or incident investigator, make sure that the cloud services are set up so that there's actually something to investigate if something has happened. So this is very much about how the system is set up to log events, how the system is set up to log user activity, and also activity on user accounts. And crucially, how long the system holds on to those events. For example, when we look at Office 365, we see a varied sort of retention rate on audit logs, anything from 7 days to a year. If somebody has to investigate an incident, 7 days worth of logs is just not enough to really get a clear picture. So one of the things you can pick up with your IT service provider, for example, is to ask them how long are our logs retained for, and what and how can we get access to those as well if we need it. So for the forensic readiness bit is actually quite key on cloud as well. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, we have some questions here, so I'm going to bring some in live. Oliver's got a really good question with regards to breach data, so I'm going to allow Oliver to talk. Oliver, over to you.
Hi there, can you hear me clearly?
Hi, Oliver. Yes, I can hear you.
Lovely. So just back on credential stuffing and related attacks, on the two-factor authentication page you had, Have I Been Pwned? Yep. Which also offers a service by which you can check whether or not a server password has been included in previous data breaches. Yep. Mm-hmm. Is that something you're familiar with and would recommend that people do, or not so much?
I think, I believe, it's run by a reputable security researcher.
Troy Hunt.
There's two schools of thought. If you don't put your password in, it shouldn't be published, or if you don't put your username in, then you don't go on another list, potentially. But I think it's safe to say that's probably one of the few services you could reliably trust, at least to put your domain name in, so you can see whether any of your domain bits of, I wouldn't put my password in, but putting in your email address, for example, or a user account name is probably a little bit less risky.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help? Yeah, okay.
I'd add to that, Oliver. Troy Hunt is highly reputable. He's based in Australia. Thoroughly decent guy who I happen to have met some time ago. Anyway, with regards to the data that's available, which he pulls from the dark web and from forums, hacker forums, it's only going to be data that's been published. So it doesn't mean that just because your data's not there, just because your email doesn't go red in terms of it, it hasn't been breached. It doesn't mean to say that your email and password haven't been breached. It just means it's not published on the dark web and it's not published in hacker forums. We also offer a service at Clearcom, which we call Darkbeam, which you can look across a corporate domain against your web and email domain. But again, it's only going to pull up breach credentials that have been published. So it is not, neither of them are silver bullets. There is no such thing as a silver bullet, which I'm sure you know, Oliver. I hope that answers your question.
And again, the sort of thing for password stuffing, as you mentioned, or sort of password guessing, if you've got that two-factor method in place, that plays a big role in actually just stopping the attacker dead in terms of, so even if he knows your password or happens to guess your password without the token, at least you're sort of reducing the risks massively that they potentially get access.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome. So we have another question here from Mike. Mike, I'm going to unmute you, if it allows me to. Maritz, I'm not. Oh, here we are, finally.
Hi there. Sorry, I didn't realise what the live questions that meant. I was going to read them out. No problem. Yeah, again, sorry, just mentioning about the 2FA that you mentioned. You gave 3 different approaches there, but I'm just wondering, of those, which is the easiest, if there is one, for the users to use? Which one does that thing where only if you're on a different computer or using a web-based service, does that apply to all 2FA, or is it only if
it depends on how it's implemented by the provider. So, for example, for Office, you can set up conditional access to only ask for two-factor under specific conditions.
Okay, right.
And my preferred approach is to have the phone app the
Yeah.
Microsoft Authenticator phone app, because all it does is it pings you and it says, do you authorize this access? So you
Yeah.
don't have to worry about codes or anything like that. You just literally on your phone, you say approve access. And obviously if you get that message and you've not done it, then obviously you know that potentially your account's being attacked. But it all depends. Some applications still rely on sending your text message.
Yeah.
So essentially they don't use any specific provider. They generate their own 6-digit number or whatever they want to use.
Yeah.
So it really depends on application. I think Microsoft's implementation is pretty slick. However, there's a couple of caveats, and I'm pretty sure the Google side of things is pretty similar as well. So,
Okay,
and
right.
there's obviously a lot of other providers of two-factor as well. Okta being a popular one, and a few other ones as well, which integrates as well.
Okay, thanks. I think, as you said, ones where you can just swipe and then that's it, you've signed in. It's served its purpose. A 6-digit code can often get a little bit.
It's a pain, especially when you've got staff that aren't that technically capable. Yeah. That is one of the biggest blockers to two-factor, is basically saying that staff do not have the technical capability. However, the flip side of that is if they don't have the technical capability to use a two-factor application, then what sort of risk do they have with usernames and passwords, really?
Yeah,
because they're more likely to write down their passwords, they're more likely to use simple passwords. So it's always a trade-off. Security is unfortunately always a trade-off.
Yeah, for sure. I've got 2 other questions, but I don't know if it's somebody else's turn first. I'm not sure.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, go thank you. You've mentioned the cyber awareness courses, so training for staff. And I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations on, a good provider. Is there a sort of an industry standard course that's good for general staff as opposed to IT people, that's out there that we could all...
I think there's some standout providers. We don't really promote any specific providers, but I know there's the likes of Bob's Business is pretty good. Sasha probably has a view on as well, a few ones that are good. But the ones you're looking for are the ones that are not just annual. They're ones that actually are a little bit more proactive in terms of bringing staff along throughout the year, maybe having snippets of awareness built in every month, every week. You get ones that actually include phishing testing as part of the package as well. So you can actually measure a little bit in terms of how well the message has gone through. So I would say if you pick something that actually engages with your staff, rather than something that's just, here's 10 slides you need to do every year.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you. Yeah. And just one more question, and I'm sorry, I apologize for it being a bit techie, this one. You mentioned sort of antivirus software or malware software, basically, and protection on servers as well. And a lot of that seems to be moving towards cloud-based security software packages as well, which is almost some kind of irony in there. Yeah. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Is it a good idea to move to the cloud, or should you really take it, bring it closer to home and manage it yourself? I'm sure there's no right answer, but I just want to...
I think the bit that's moving to the cloud is the management platform side of things. Yeah. So essentially, and everybody seems to be doing this now, where you don't actually have a policy server or something on site anymore.
Yeah.
That side of things will be managed by the service provider. So Semantic, all those guys potentially have got a management console that you log in that's on the web, and then all your machines just talk with that management console. Windows do the same with Windows Defender. So I think that's just the way the market's moving. Your main antivirus bits is still running locally though.
Yeah, exactly. Just managing it remotely. So yeah, because we're just in a point where we're about to transition from having 2 or 3 antivirus software servers on site to a cloud solution, and it just seems the way forward. But I thought I'd double check. Yeah,
there's benefits because you don't necessarily have to update the thing all the time, or make sure that you're linked back to the service providers working. Because essentially everything's managed centrally. But yeah, I mean, again, there's lots of different vendors out there. There's a big move towards Microsoft Defender itself as well, because it's sort of integrated into Windows and it's integrated with Office 365 as well through some of the higher tiers of licensing. So you get advanced threat protection, for example, which then pulls all the information from your endpoints. And there's some really good stuff coming out of Microsoft. Not that I'm obviously not paid by them, but there's some really good anti-malware stuff coming from Microsoft as well. So don't discount them if you look at your options.
But don't think of it as a silver bullet either, because we are seeing malware that's very stealthy and actually avoids a lot of the very well thought of anti-malware, anti-ransomware. So you know, don't completely rely on your antivirus. Unfortunately, werewolves are going to slip through still.
Is it still possible to run Windows Defender with a third-party software? Because there was a time when they conflict with each other, and you basically had to choose one or the other. And
I would still choose one or the other. I don't know. I mean, that's just me. I think once you start adding layers, I don't know how effective that is really.
Yeah. Okay.
Especially as Defender is now sort of turned into a fully fledged anti-malware solution rather than something that sort of just runs in the background looking for strange behavior.
Okay.
And Mike, I hope, going back to your question about training, I agree with what Maritz was saying. I do really recommend that you have a mixture of e-learning and more regular interactive webinar or on-site training. I feel that mix really creates a more robust culture. I recommend, there's some really good e-learning out there. We do e-learning, but I'm biased. But we also, Bob's Business is really good e-learning. And we also deliver, and this is where we're going to show off because we're good at it. We deliver really good cybersecurity webinars and on-site training, which is pretty engaging. I hope you might think this webinar is engaging too, but yeah, we like to sort of shock and scare, but at the same time, really engage employees from a personal level and then take it to an organizational level so that they realize that, you know, cybersecurity affects each and every one of us on a daily basis from an individual perspective as well as from an organizational perspective. And I find that is key.
Got it. Okay. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you. Thank you, Maritz.
No problem. Any other questions in the line?
No, Danny Cadman has mentioned something. He was saying that they use multi-factor authentication from Microsoft. They find it seamless. It just asks the user's work mobile if they wish to approve or deny the log on request. I was agreeing, you know, he's agreeing with what you were saying earlier about, you know, that multi-factor authentication is quite seamless nowadays. I'd add, you know, single sign-on if you're using multiple software systems. If you want to make it even easier for the user, a single sign-on piece is also really helpful.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we've covered it.
Oh, sorry, I missed the name of that software that the other listener just gave. What was it? Sorry.
Bob's Business.
No, the chap whose message was just read out, what he used for his 2FA.
That was just Microsoft. So he was using Microsoft. I'm just checking what just bear with me, Mike.
My suspicion is just the built-in Microsoft two-factor authentication.
Yes, it is just Microsoft.
Oh, okay.
2FA.
That's right. It's a little app that you can get. It's a Microsoft.
Yeah, it's the app. It's the app. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. I think we've almost covered it. I'm just going to check to make sure that we've covered every single question. We've had some really nice comments as well. Jackie James has written, thanks to everyone that have asked questions. They've been really helpful. So Maritz, thank you very, very much indeed. And
thank you. So
I'm sure you want to say thanks to everyone attending as well.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you everybody for attending. You can always, if you got any more questions, please just feel free to send it on to Vanessa, who I think is probably she's still in the call, but she's very quiet in the background.
I am.
So yeah, please feel free to send them on, and we'll answer them best we can. All right. Good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
See you then.
In the digital world as well as the physical one.